Dr. Larry Brown, research biologist at the U.S. Geological Survey's California Water Science Center. He received his BS in Biological Sciences from UC Irvine and his Bachelor's in Science in Wildlife and Fisheries Biology from UC Davis. He received his Master's and Ph.D. in Ecology also from UC Davis. With over 5 years of experience in California aquatic systems, he is a recognized expert on the ecology of California fishes. He published extensively on California fishes, benthic invertebrates, and benthic algae. His current interests include effects of altered flow regimes, changes in trophic dynamics, relations between tidal wetlands and fishes, effects of climate change on fish species, and factors associated with declines in pelagic fish populations of the San Francisco estuary. Titled Food Webs of the Delta-Suisun Bay and Suisun Marsh, an update on current understanding and possibilities for management, is one of a series of our State of the Bay Delta Science 2016 Brown Bag series. This 2016 is a collection of peer-reviewed articles that summarizes the scientific understanding of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The batch publication that includes Larry Brown's article on food webs was published in October in the journal San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Brown.
People, another couple of minutes to call in. So all right. Well, I didn't write this paper alone. I had a few very good co-authors who gave material on various things, and I kind of stitched it all together along with my own thoughts. When I asked them if anybody else wanted to give this talk, they all laughed at me. So here I am. Thought that it's not a good thing to be here. So kind of kidding. The outline is pretty straightforward. Just go over briefly. Introductory stuff you guys here and on the phone already know, but I'll go over it anyway for the one person who might not know. Do we care? Is it one food web or many? Have we lost as far as food webs and food web function? Can we go back to that? And then we can't go back to it. What can we fix? This is a paper. I don't really intend to review the contents of the paper in detail. That would be painful for all of us. So I'm just going to hit some of the big themes as kind of already shown in the outline. I thought the interest here would be more in some of the management issues, so kind of what I'm stressing here. So if you're interested in the details, read the paper, or even better, go through at some of the primary literature we looked at when we wrote the paper. There's actually a lot. Years ago, there was probably hardly anything. Years ago, there was quite a bit. Now there's a lot on food webs. And it's very interesting. One caveat I wanted to put in there, because nutrients and ammonium are such a big deal when we're talking about food webs, I pretty much took a complete punt on that and left it for the nutrient chapter to deal with. None of us are particularly well versed in that genre, so we left it to those who know much more than we do about it. And we'll just do that. So care. Because we don't have any delta smelt. Actually, I'm kind of concerned about food webs. Began with pelagic organism decline. I believe most of you are probably of that. Around 2003, we had a real crash in all the populations of pelagic fishes in the estuary. And the question was asked, well, why has this happened? And largely delta smelt issues, but now we have longfin smelt issues as well to deal with. So it's an important question. An old pod conceptual model And this bottom-up food availability, food quality thing was something we recognized early on in the middle 2000s. That's been kind of an ongoing area of interest as far as, can we restore these native fishes to higher population abundances? So that's where food webs come in. Also, shouldn't forget salmon. I'd be the first to admit that, but shouldn't forget salmon because it's already established from other areas in the Pacific Northwest that salmon actually are well documented as moving into wetlands on the tide or into tidal channels to feed and to. So we all know that these wetlands have functions for salmonids. So that's not something I'm going to talk about, but it's something you should always remember. Was it one food web or many? And this may sound kind of a weird question, but this is a simplified food web for the entire Suisun Bay Delta ecosystem that we put together in a modeling exercise. And this is why people hate dealing with food web spaghetti diagrams, because the spaghetti goes everywhere. There's so many connections. It's really hard to understand what's actually going on. So, simplify that for area of interest, which is, again, Suisun Bay and the freshwater delta. And the answer is yes. And we as humans like to put things into boxes, and these are the usual boxes we use for food webs. Recognize that specific habitats have specific food webs. While connections might be the same between other habitat food webs, but the emphasis is different, and the species involved might be different. So for the purposes of the paper, identified the food webs here: tidal wetlands, submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, floodplain inputs from upstream, and the pelagic and benthic food webs. Those are linked because the connection between clams grazing on phytoplankton from the pelagic and fish and parts of the food web is something we've all kind of recognized for quite a while here. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to discuss those separately. So like this, but it's always important to remember that the interactions between these different things vary both with the specific place you're in and the time of year or the type of water year you're in. So even though we're putting things into boxes, the way they interact and change over time is variable. So you always have to keep that in mind when you're talking about food webs. I identified some general areas where the specific habitat specific to food webs are particularly important. So floodplains, we have Yolo bypass, Consumnes McCollum floodplains, and that's pretty much a one-way subsidy from floodplain into the delta area. Marsh up here, which is partly a brackish water marsh, but it also has a lot of pelagic benthic and larger channels, so that's kind of a mixture of two. We have salinity zone, which moves about. That's mainly the pelagic benthic food web. We have a large area of the south central delta, which is a mix of the aquatic vegetation food web and all the deeper channels of pelagic benthic. And then water north delta up here, which is kind of interesting because it has a nice mix of a lot of different things. And in fact, might be one of the reasons it seems to remain reasonably good habitat for a lot. So just briefly, kind of through each of the food web types we were talking about. I think every slide here is a different format, which kind of shows a variety of ways you can think about food webs. But it's also slides I could steal from other people without redoing them all in a unified format. So this is a slide from Ted Summer. You're all familiar with the work he does in Yolo bypass. Yolo bypass, when it's flooded, provides good rear habitat for salmonids in particular. That's been the emphasis of the work there. But actually a number of other species, both native and introduced, go up there and spawn and rear up there for various length of time. Oops, kind of the base of that food web, at least for the salmonids, are chironomids. But zooplankton going in there after the starts warming up, and it's been moved slowly through there for a couple of weeks. So chironomids are mainly an in-habitat subsidy, but plankton actually comes out of Yellow Bypass out into the North Delta, providing subsidy to our Delta food web as well. Again, the influence of Yellow Bypass is one of the interesting things about the North Delta because it has that floodplain input that we're missing from a lot of the rest of the Delta. A Delta tidal wetland conceptual model. I worked with other people. Rosemary Hartman is one who's put together the slide. The thing here is just the variety of primary production as you expect in tidal wetlands, and it kind of depends on, the natural land or the wetland you construct, kind of what the mix of habitats there is. So if you open water, you can expect phytoplankton. You might get microcystis, depending on other conditions. You can get production by benthic microalgae or epiphytic algae on the plants. And the thing we always talk about with tidal wetlands is this big pool of detritus that comes from the plants and the terrestrial plants that are part of the wetland vegetation. The detrital part of the food web is very slow. It takes bacteria, fungi a long time to break some of this stuff down, but it's pretty steady, and depending on how much you have in your wetland or your area as a whole, it can apply a substantial food for fish that can get in there and have access to it. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. So the inputs, these are it's coming in from out the wetland into it, and that'd be mainly on with the tide cycle. So not only things coming off the wetland, things going in there, and what come out again is kind of an interesting question. The benthic food web is the one we actually discuss a lot. This is a simple model that Wim has often used in his presentation, so I'm using it here. Again, it includes the idea of transport from other areas into the low salinity zone. So this is transport from upstream. Pseudodiapnemus comes in there from the freshwater delta. Also, this is the detritus component. So particulate or organic carbon with bacteria and stuff growing on it. That can actually go to the food web. We have primary producers here, zooplankton, up through the zooplankton that pelagic fish use. A lot of this stuff also goes to the clams. So that's where these little open circle pathways are. And Potemcorbula doesn't just eat primary production, it doesn't just eat phytoplankton. It can also eat small zooplankton in the early stages of some of the zooplankton we want our delta smelt to have. So they're particularly an issue in the salinity zone. That Lenny Grimaldo put together, showing kind of the interaction between submerged aquatic vegetation to the side and the pelagic inlet. So the food web is actually very, very productive. It's plants themselves, but phyllis algae and diatoms and stuff that actually grow on the plants. So it's actually providing a structure for other things to happen rather than just being a sort of primary production themselves. In fact, there's very few things out there that actually eat the vegetation. It's mainly the epiphytes. That habitat supports a variety of invertebrates, and those invertebrates support fishes kinds, mostly introduced fishes, but there are some natives that can actually do well in these beds. Get out into the pelagic, threadfin shad, the zoltan, and somewhat Mississippi silversides are really supported by production kind of on the edge of the beds or the pelagic production from plankton. Another interesting transport question, again, transport's going to be a section of the talk later, is where tidal wetlands production can actually get through these beds of submerged aquatic vegetation if there are some, between the wetland and the open water, if material can actually get out all the way into the pelagic. Because lots of things in here that would eat whatever was coming off the wetland trying to get out to the pelagic zone. So this is another issue with submerged aquatic vegetation that people haven't thought too much about, actually. Another cartoon kind of showing that. So assuming tidal marsh here on one side, a bed of SAV in the middle, and your tidal channel out here, there's stuff that can actually go on between the tidal marsh, tidal channels. So there's feeding invertebrates in the AV beds, so organic matter that's produced in the wetland might not actually get all the way through, and the fluxes between the SAV and the pelagic habitat that similar to or different than what would come in from the wetland. We haven't really looked at that in any detail at this point. This graph was actually from a proposal I submitted twice trying to get people interested in doing this and never got funded. Okay, so what have we lost? I pretty much stole this talk directly from Jim Clorn's Bay Delta Science conference talk, with his mission, of course. Here with the work that's been done with historical landscapes, and those landscapes actually immediately pose a question, well, can I translate those landscapes into food web production for each of those different types of habitat? I brought a group of people together to kind of ask that question, and they put together this report that outlined research strategy for actually doing that. And basically you're going to step through that because it kind of highlights food processes that I think it's important to consider when you're thinking about restoring wetlands and food web processes within those wetlands and connecting it to other areas. So this report is actually online. If you look at it, it's actually a really good report, especially the appendices, so I'd encourage you to look at that. Kind of what Jim's first cut at it was, so he basically looked at how much pelagic habitat there was and how much tidal wetland habitat there was, and then applied some literature values to, grams of carbon months late to found was, the habitats is that in the past there was a huge contribution of primary production from tidal wetland plants, just a bit from pelagic, and they were mainly pelagic based, just tidal wetland. But of course it doesn't include a lot of things, other primary producers, food quality, plays into transfer efficiency. So what does production have to be processed a lot before it becomes available to consumers or not? And activity, can material produced in a wetland actually get out to the pelagic where we want fish to eat it, and just variability in conditions. So we'll go into that in a little more detail. So our producers, these are things that are, so in the pelagic we have phytoplankton, and then we have tules and other vascular plants on flats, and in tidal channels we have algae growing on the surface. There's riparian vegetation along the channels, and there are native submerged aquatic vegetation as well. And now we have a lot of introduced, so we need to consider aquatic vascular primaries as well. So if you look at the availability, again, you see quite a mixed stuff in the historical, but dominated by the marsh. Again, primary pelagic, and some marsh. Part of the strategy is looking at each of these compartments and translating that into a number for primary production for that habitat in the past. We need to consider food quality, so protein content, basically sugar content and fat content. Phytoplankton by far is a better quality food for zooplankton and fish that eat phytoplankton directly. Vascular plants are much less so, need to be processed through a couple of steps before it would become available to a fish. Is, as you might expect, not very good quality food. And this is, actually, that's the source of kind of Bill Subzak's work back in the early 2000s. There were a big group of people looking at food web processes. This is kind of why riverine inputs of material was kind of discounted as an important part of the food web, because coming in very, very low quality. So it took a long time process, and a lot of it actually moved through the system before it got to the point where it could fish. And now is that by establishing tidal wetlands, where there's a time for stuff to sit there and get processed, it can provide kind of a steady output of sources to the food web instead of one puts of very low quality material. So food quality, you have to consider this transfer efficiency. So this to this, phytoplankton is actually transferred very efficiently. It basically goes through a couple of steps into the zooplankton, into the fish. These require more processing. So it takes longer because it has to go through more steps to get a form that's accessible to the organisms we're concerned about. Connectivity is a really important issue that I started thinking about in detail recently, but it's actually something to be thinking about. So in the past, inundation occurred throughout the wetlands in the central, north, and south deltas. Very little of that. So both use on the island has changed to agriculture, and we've isolated them from the channels. So there's not much connectivity there anymore. This is of a lot of channels in the Delta and Suisun look like now. They have levees on them. Even at high tide, things don't flood. In the past, there were very low levees there that were formed naturally, and they'd flood pretty consistently. An interesting statistic is that the area of channel edge that can actually overflow into wetland habitat and that's been reduced from 3,000 kilometers to 31 kilometers in the delta. So you see that that activity between the terrestrial, intertidal, and the channels has been reduced a lot. So if there is material produced, tidallands on the other side of a levee, there's no way to get it there without either engineering a connection or providing these natural connections, which we've lost. I talk about this a lot, but I want to get to production from various areas being transferred to the pelagic zone. In exercise, you have to implement of monitoring, so you have to connect the hydrodynamics to materials being produced to see how much of it's being from the marsh into the channels. And now variability, this is the connectivity thing, but there is variability in how much area got flooded. So in a wet year, these darker areas is an extra 1,000 square kilometers of flooded habitat that could contribute material to the food web. Here, pretty much when you get a levee break, you're pretty much just flooding yellow bypass. And that's a substantial area, but that doesn't happen very often. And it's pretty much the only area where that happens on a large scale. So what we had, I've kind of summarized a lot of this stuff in this little graphic. This wasn't in the paper, but one of the reviewers hated it. And when I considered how much explanation it would take, it was like, and quite honestly, there are a lot of problems with it because it includes a lot of speculation, but I could summarize as major changes that have taken place. So I'll go through it real quick. So it's kind of that pre-gold rush delta we were talking about earlier. Then we had big floodplain subsidies into the river, in-river production, and that material was moved by floods down into the freshwater delta. So the large subsidy there within the delta, there was some pelagic, a lot of tidal wetland production, and a little bit of littoral and benthic that all needed food resources within the freshwater delta that all went to native fishes because we didn't have any introduced fishes yet. So a lot of that material was used in the delta, but a lot also moved down into the low salinity zone. The zone also had substantial marshes, say around Suisun Bay. Those are still there, but not as much as there used to be, and big inputs from Suisun Marsh as well. A big pelagic component. Again, we get tidal exchange here, where some stuff might actually get moved up a little bit with flows, but still a mix of production, again, going to all native fishes, and that stuff moves out into higher salinity habitats, Marsh and San Francisco Bay. If we look at what was there in the 80s, after we'd had a chance to actually implement monitoring and understand what was going on in Suisun Bay at that time, this will get that shift to pelagic, freshwater delta and low salinity zone. We've lost our tidal and seasonal wetlands. We've lost our floodplains. So notice in that earlier graphic from the length of those bars of contribution from various habitats was much lower currently because we're simply not having much primary production because there's not as much habitat as there was in the past. We now have invasive fishes and curbicula in the delta that consumes some stuff. So even with that lesser of production, a bit of it's going to invasive animals and less to native fishes. So they're even in a little more trouble there. And same in the low salinity zone. And that, as an author, we've seen a variety of changes, kind of constant change through the present. Look at what we have now. We have little rain. We don't have any marshes. Has basically crashed now. So the only game down in the freshwater delta is the SAV habitats, which, as I mentioned, are very productive, and there probably is some export of that in tidal habitats. Salinity zone, where delta smelt and all the pod fishes used to hang out, is very unproductive at this point. So that's for them to eat, and what is there goes to invasive fishes and clams and stuff. At the change in direction, this arrow, a lot of the work that WIM's doing is showing that both upstream and downstream are providing a subsidy to the low salinity zone because there's so little friction there. So there's stuff coming from both sides and disappearing into clams and the few fish that are there, which is distressing. So, to the past, and the answer to this, no. And a big reason for that is just the huge number of introduced species we have to deal with. Introduced densa, that provides excellent habitat for intercentrarchids. Some can actually use that habitat, but not what we're horribly concerned about. So salmon can use the edge of these things. Split-tail also feed on the edge. Whales beds, tule perch, and prickly sculpin are the native that do the best. This is not a habitat that the salts use. The submerged aquatic vegetation. Also, we have a good idea of what floating vegetation does. Obviously, shades the water, so there's less phytoplankton production. It also the SAV community, but nobody's actually measured that or looked at it. Especially in these drought years when we've had so much trouble with hyacinth, we really don't know what effects that has had the food webs. And Axistis is an invasive, but that's all causing us problems as well because of toxicity, and it's just not very high quality food. All heard many talks about clams, but that Jan Thompson and Lisa Lucas have done at USGS has shown that curbicula can limit phytoplankton biomass in freshwaters. This is Frank and Eldert Island, where they've done a lot of work. Just tons grazing down phytoplankton. And we've seen this with Potamicorbula in the low salinity zone as well. This is when the introduction took place, and blooms that occurred regularly in past years no longer occurring, and that's related to clam grazing. And California is not lose population or product agriculture. People need water. There's so water taken out of the delta somehow. How that ultimately is, I guess, remains to be seen. But that's something that's not going to change either. So can we fix it? I don't know. We're going to try, I guess. Let's go back and look at some of those historical functions we talked about earlier. For primary producers, you grow the plants. So you provide the habitat, that's exactly what habitat restoration does. So that's a good thing that people are doing. We seem to be concentrated on the Suisun Marsh, which is fine, but we have to hear how these other things will change habitat restoration as well. You get more microalgae, depending on how big your project is and what the flooding regime is. You may or may not get riparian, and we'll get invasions of submerged aquatic vegetation, whether it's native, would presumably be good, or introduced that may cause you problems, kind of remains to be seen. And whether you can actually design a project to keep submerged vegetation out, and it's been discussed, but nobody's figured out how to do it, at least to my knowledge. The thing that needs to be considered is if habitat for microcystis or other harmful algae. I don't think we really know how to design to avoid that. It seems to be mainly a temperature-based thing. So if you have a project that's going to warm up, that may encourage establishment of microcystis. How long it's there, and how large blooms are might depend on what your activity is to the channels. So, already went through this. I'm probably going to pretty much spending the rest of the time on this habitat connectivity thing. Some of us was workshop and kind of ruffled a bunch of feathers. Em said tidal we're not going to export zooplankton to pelagic habitats and help delta smelt. I think we hopefully a little better in this paper that came out as a product of this. We weren't saying that tidal wetlands were not good. There were a lot of good things, but that zooplankton question is kind of an open one. So if you kind of look at kind of how tidal wetland might work, you have interior channels. You're going to get stuff coming off the wetland as a net positive. So you get invertebrates and forms of organic carbon coming off the plain into the channels and being exported out into the question becomes, how long is the water there? Do plankton actually have time to significantly reproduce and become abundant or not? Are they washing out from the major channels? And that can be kind of a design thing. Same thing with zooplankton. So phytoplankton need a couple of days to start the population to grow. Plankton actually need a couple of weeks. This is why Wim said tidal wetland is not going to produce massive amounts of zooplankton because they're not there on the marsh plain or in the channels long enough to actually build up large populations. And the fish question becomes, well, if it's not being exported, can fish get into the wetland to actually exploit that production kind of on-site channel? So there's actually a lot of interesting questions to be asked here. That is that habitat restoration would create more shallow water habitat that would create habitat where phytoplankton can grow, and that could be depends on whether there are grazers there that actually eat that stuff before it got exported from whatever project you're talking about. Kind of this thing with velocity, slower seems to be greener because phytoplankton have more time to grow. But if there are clams in the system, a lot of that production might actually go into clams instead of being exported out into the pelagic. And this is just a more complex way of looking at that. basically, the longer things are there at grazing, you get more production. The longer things are there where you have high grazing, the less actually is. So this is that needs to be considered, but also in assessing what the probable outcomes of a project might be. So I think it's just something to think about. I want to talk about something that actually Chris Enright could probably talk about better than I can, is kind of connectivity issues. And this is actually from a talk that John Bureau gave also at the conference. So I'll just created a DM for the historic delta so they can actually run a hydrodynamic model options and present conditions and do a comparison of what might be going on hydrodynamically and how the connection between different habitats occurs. And factors in thinking about that are ones that ecologists don't necessarily think about that much. So when Yolo Bypass was being established as part of the flood control system for Sacramento, they did it dredging to get water from here through slough and out in the bay. So they made a really deep channel, and they continue to dredge that and keep that open to maintain floodation. I talked about this before. So in the contemporary, our channels aren't connected near shore habitats, and there are a lot of connections. There are actually three things to think about coming out of John's talk that actually struck me. That Kina Straits is a hydrologic control, so the tidal energy coming into the system is actually close to the same now as it was then. The question of where that energy goes parts are current and the purple parts are past conditions. And what you see is that dredging was very effective because a lot more tidal energy coming up through slough into this area there was in the past. Still quite a bit there because that was going up the Sacramento River, but not as there used to be. And there's almost nothing going into Suisun Marsh wetlands at this point. That's because they've been diked. John also described it as tides are lazy. They go to the easiest place they can go, the closest area. So in the past, a lot of that tidal energy went into Suisun Marsh to flood those funds. Since it can't there anymore, it goes here. Kind of a regional perspective, thinking about what might happen, start opening up Suisun Marsh, how affect the amount of water coming up into these here. We're putting a lot of effort into storing habitats, the North Delta. I don't know. Doing Suisun Marsh here might, would be sufficient magnitude to actually affect that or not. But you could approach with a model. It seems like something that might be worth doing. If we get down to a little more local, we have that tidal energy coming up into the North Delta. That's are kind of as the tidal excursion goes, so how much that water comes up and in these systems. And what we can see is that of the tidal excursion, you actually get this chlorophyll concentration. So these are dead ooze. This one actually has a diversion on it somewhere. This is Lindsay and Barker Slough, and East Bay has a water intake there, so there's some water pumped out. The island and Miners Slough. So this is actually Sacramento River water. See kind of these end sloughs seem to be developing higher chlorophyll concentrations. That's the thing. and this is ARC folks, Peter Moyle's group at UC Davis has actually looked at these flues pretty extensively. So if we had less tidal energy coming in here, I mean, these spots would move down close way. We might actually get more production up there. The question then becomes, are the not able to exploit that production? And during the summer, at least, these areas are actually too warm for delta smelt. So there's production going on, but it's mainly going to threadfin shad and American shad, which are warm water fish, and it's probably not getting out as much. The delta smelt are in Deepwater Ship Channel and somewhat in Liberty Island, and you can kind of see the same sort of thing in Liberty Island. We have water coming up through Cache Slough, kind of in the lower part here. Actually more tidal wetland production up at this end, and then the mixing zone here. So, might actually be able to get up in here. In fact, they do take advantage of this habitat, somewhat dependent on temperature. During these pandemic issues and connectivity issues, I think are important when you're trying to understand the benefits of a particular tidal wetland project. Ability to change that much, and we can't do that much about. Most of the variability comes from droughts and floods. So that's going to change too much. So kind of the take-home messages I wanted you to have talk is that food webs are not static in space or time. They're constantly changing. Historics are gone, but understanding how they work teaches us some important lessons of what we'll be able to do with tidal wetland restoration. And habitat connectivity at the regional and local scales, I think, is critical, to understanding the function of areas we might be restoring. So I don't think that's, minutes for questions, so I'd be glad to answer any I could.
Okay. Testing. Any questions?
Hi. Or ask you a question on this part of your talk where you're saying, is there anything we could fix, or you might use another word, modify? On Liberty, you had a beautiful graph there at the end that shows high production up these channels. Liberty Island is more like a giant lake.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, using the general concept of food web in different habitats, what would you first be to the construction of 4 linear barriers that go up and create 4 total dead-end sloughs, just like Cache Slough, just like the other one. Lindsay, well, Cache itself going up Lindsay. So during non-flooding periods, we have these, I'm just pretend 4 tidal channels rather than one large Liberty Lake. So that's a little bit of engineering, but wouldn't that shift things into a different habitat primary production regime? Or might it?
Sorry to interrupt. Can you please try to read that question? I think that microphone went out halfway through.
Okay, so the question was, Liberty Island in its present form is pretty much kind of a shallow tidal lake, major outlet at the south end. The question was, if engineered other 4 channels in that area, presumably by dumping dirt or something in there and kind of constructing a wetland in that same area rather than having the lake that be a net benefit or not. Honestly, don't know. Island as it is, it was an accident. Nobody designed it. It just happened. And it does seem to be that smelt do use quite a bit around at all. And we don't have a ton of evidence that a lot of time in small channels. I don't say they didn't spend any time in channels because they did. We don't know the kind of size they would frequent. So I model the amount of reduction you'd get from both of those different habitats. But sure, I would say about what the best to smelt would be from that. And what you could, guess about whether there'd be a net increase or net dip between those two configurations. And with the dynamic modeling, you could say something about conductivity and were long enough to be that end area. Maybe you'd get things come in there and produce more, but I'm not going to say one way or the other on that. It would be an interesting exercise to go through, actually. That's what you can do with a model.
Hey, Larry, it seems like we're always wondering about the importance of detrital food chains, but it seems like mid-carbonomids are an example of a really important food chain, the food chain that may actually be driving salmonid production.
Yeah, and I think, the evidence from yellow bypass, shows that clearly. And in the water delta, you'll probably get a lot of curves, in tidal wetlands that are established there. So, yeah, that whole, I went quickly, but that whole graphic of invertebrates produced, tidal wetland detritus and, on the plants and stuff, that is a benefit that, what kind of project you build, it has emergent vegetation. And salmonid-wise, it depends on if it's on a migration corridor or not. So what's the probability that a fish is actually going to swim by that and have the chance to swim in and take advantage of it? Something way on the south, away from the channel of San Joaquin, might not be very accessible. But like Delta, when bypass is flowing or along the Sacramento, sure. Yeah, there's doubt in my mind that salmon would derive a benefit from that.
This is more of just a comment. When you were discussing the export of phytoplankton and zooplankton into the channel, I think one of the points from that 2013 seminar that you didn't bring up is the magnitude.
Right.
So even if you have water sitting on a tidal wetland for long enough that there's a high abundance of phytoplankton or zooplankton in that water, that when that small little pond water reconnects with a huge volume channel and gets diluted out, that may, even if you've cooked a lot of zooplankton, you may not have very much of a subsidy to the pelagic environment. And I think, in the size of the tidal wetlands projects and just they are, that magnitude is a really important consideration when we think about what effect these things are really going to have on the pelagic food web.
Yeah, that's conversations with people after their job, kind of on this topic, and yeah, that's one of the we called for at the end of the paper was, taking kind of a regional perspective. And I think that conversation kind of evolved towards, well, okay, maybe we can't provide subsidy to kind of cash slew, pasture stuff, but maybe organize things right. You could create kind of a region like in North Delta where it actually have some effect. But again, that would really actually plan putting a lot of these things instead of be working, that you take opportunities that are available to you, and you can't fault that. It kind of takes a regional planning perspective off the table.